The hot Brazilian sun bore down on the sugar fields like a relentless hammer, beating the backs of the slaves who bent over the endless rows of cane. In the distance, the sprawling estate of Senhor Rocha, the plantation's ruthless master, stood tall, its gleaming white walls, a stark contrast to the dirt and sweat of the fields below. Among the slaves toiling in the heat was Pedro, a man whose quiet strength had long since set him apart from the others. His body, tanned and worn by years of labor, moved with purpose, each step a reminder that he had survived longer than most. Pedro's story was one of silence, patience, and rage. The kind of rage that simmered quietly beneath the surface of a man who had seen too much suffering, too much cruelty. And in the fields, surrounded by the towering cane stalks that stretched endlessly into the horizon, Pedro knew that the time for patience was coming to an end. His master, Senhor Rocha, rode through the rows of slaves like a king inspecting his kingdom, but Pedro had long since stopped fearing him. He had witnessed the horrors inflicted on his fellow slaves' lashes for the smallest mistakes, death for those who dared to rebel. Yet, there was something different about Pedro. While others had been broken by the whip and the work, he had held on to a sharpness in his mind, a fire in his heart that nothing could extinguish. And as the heat of the day pressed down on the fields, Pedro knew that his time would come. He would not be a slave forever. Before we enter the heart of Pedro's rebellion, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Drop a comment below, and if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in the cane fields of Brazil for far too long. The sun beat down mercilessly over the Brazilian sugar plantation, its heat searing the backs of the slaves toiling in the fields. The long rows of sugar cane stretched for miles, their thick green stalks swaying gently in the breeze, but the beauty of the land was lost on those who labored beneath the burning Sunday. To Pedro, the fields were both his prison and his battleground. Each step he took was heavy, the weight of his chains pressing into the earth with every movement. He had known this life from the moment he had been taken from his home, forced into servitude in this foreign land. He was tall, strong, his skin darkened by years of sun and sweat, his hands calloused from the constant work. Pedro was not like the others who had been broken by the land. He was different. His body may have been worn down by the endless days of labor, but his spirit was unyielding, hardened by a silent fire that burned deep inside him. He had seen many slaves give in to despair, their bodies withering, their minds shattered by the brutality of their masters. But not Pedro. He had always kept his mind sharp, always watching, always waiting. The overseer, a cruel man named Jorge, rode through the fields on horseback, his whip raised high as he shouted orders to the slaves. His eyes were cold, and his voice carried the weight of authority, the kind of authority that could send a man to his knees with a single word. But Pedro had long since stopped fearing Jorge. He had learned the ways of the plantation, the rhythms of the whip, the demands of the masters. He had learned when to submit and when to resist. But more importantly, he had learned to be patient. Patience was a slave's greatest weapon, and Pedro was a master of it. As Pedro moved down the row of sugarcane, his mind drifted back to the events that had led him here. He had been born in the hills of Bahia, a simple farmer's son, before the slave traders had come. They had promised riches to his family, a better life in the great plantations of Brazil. But that was a lie, as all lies were. Instead of riches, his family had been torn apart, his parents sold to different owners. And Pedro? He had been sent to work the sugar fields. A lifetime of servitude awaited him, but he had never once forgotten the taste of freedom. He glanced up for a moment, catching sight of the grand house that loomed in the distance. Senhor Rocha, the plantation owner, resided there, surrounded by the luxuries of a world far removed from the fields. It was in this house that Pedro's fate had been sealed. Rocha was a man of wealth and pride, but also of cruelty. He had inherited the plantation from his father, who had built it on the backs of men like Pedro. The men and women of the plantation had been forced to toil under the harshest conditions, working long hours under the watchful eyes of the overseers, who took pleasure in the suffering of the slaves. But it was Rocha's cruelty that had broken something inside Pedro. The master's whips, his cold words, and his endless demands had crushed the spirits of many. But Pedro had never bowed. He had seen his fellow slaves suffer, watched them broken under the weight of their oppression. Yet, despite it all, Pedro had held on to something that many others had lost: his sense of self. On this particular day, the air was thick with the stench of the cane fields, the scent of the earth, of sweat, of blood. Pedro's mind was elsewhere, lost in the fog of his thoughts, until the sharp crack of the overseer's whip pierced the air. It was followed by the scream of a man, one of Pedro's fellow slaves. Pedro turned, his gaze falling on a man named Marcos, who had stumbled in the fields, unable to keep up with the grueling pace set by Jorge. "Get up, you lazy dog," Jorge shouted, his whip cracking again, this time across Marcos's back. The slave crumpled, his body shuddering from the impact. The overseer dismounted from his horse, his face twisted in disgust as he grabbed Marcos by the hair, pulling him roughly to his feet. Pedro's blood boiled. He could feel the familiar heat rising in his chest, the heat of rage, of injustice. For a moment, he considered rushing toward Jorge, taking the whip from his hands and putting an end to the cruelty. But he knew better. If he acted impulsively, if he gave in to the fury that burned within him, he would die in the fields, just another nameless slave to be buried and forgotten. Instead, he turned away, his jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The image of Marcos's beaten body stayed with him, a reminder of the brutal system he had been forced to endure. But it was also a reminder that the time for patience was running out. He could no longer wait for justice to come from those in power. It would not. The only justice that would be served would come from his own hands. The days passed, each one blending into the next. The relentless work continued, and Zainab's presence in Pedro's thoughts grew stronger. He remembered her name from when they were both younger, when she had been a slave in the plantation fields, much like Pedro. They had shared stolen glances, whispered words in the darkness, and Pedro had grown to trust her like a sister. He knew that she too had felt the same fire, the same longing for freedom. It was Zainab's quiet strength that had inspired him to act. It was she who had taught him to hold his ground, to wait for the right moment. The day would come when he would stand at the crossroads of destiny and make his choice. And when that day arrived, he would no longer be a slave. He would be free. The days dragged on like the hours of labor in the scorching sun, each one melding into the next in a monotonous, grueling routine. Pedro's hands were raw from the constant slicing of sugarcane, the jagged edges of the stalks cutting into his skin with each violent swipe of the cane knife. The knife, a long, curved blade, was a tool of both work and destruction. It was the instrument that turned Pedro's life into an endless cycle of toil, yet it was also a symbol of power, a power he would soon claim for himself. Pedro had been carrying the cane knife for years, never thinking much of it beyond the necessity it served in his daily labor. It was a tool to survive, to cut the sugarcane and harvest the crop that fed the plantation's wealth. But now, as the heat of the day beat down upon the rows of cane, the blade felt different in his hand. It was heavier, not from the physical weight, but from the weight of what it represented. The blade was his ticket to freedom or death, depending on how he wielded it. The overseers patrolled the rows of slaves, cracking their whips and shouting orders as they moved between the workers. One of them, a man named Vicente, was particularly harsh, taking pleasure in the fear he instilled in the slaves. His cruel gaze swept across Pedro, but Pedro did not flinch. He had learned long ago that fear was the most dangerous thing a slave could give to their masters. Fear was control, and Pedro refused to be controlled any longer. It wasn't long before Vicente approached Pedro, his eyes narrowing as he saw Pedro working at a slower pace than usual. The heat had taken its toll on the slaves, but Vicente was merciless, expecting perfection from every laborer. "What's this, Pedro?" Vicente's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Do I have to remind you what happens to the lazy ones?" Pedro glanced up, meeting the overseer's eyes with a calmness that masked the turmoil beneath. "I'm not lazy," Pedro said quietly, his voice even. "Just tired." Vicente's hand twitched toward his whip. "Tired?" he sneered. "You've got plenty of time to be tired when you're in the ground, boy." Pedro's muscles tensed, his fingers tightening around the cane knife's hilt. He could feel the hot anger rise within him, but he pushed it down, keeping his face impassive. He had learned that to fight the overseers directly was to invite certain death. But his mind was already turning, his thoughts racing toward something else, a way out. He would not survive much longer if he continued to live this way, enduring the cruelty of the overseers and the brutal work of the plantation. But there was something different now. The knife was more than just a tool. It was a promise of something to come. With a grunt of frustration, Vicente swung his whip down toward Pedro's back. The crack of the leather echoed through the fields, and Pedro's body tensed in anticipation of the sting. But before the whip could make contact, Pedro's hand shot out, grabbing the cane knife with a swift, practiced movement. The blade flashed in the sunlight, and with one swift motion, Pedro slashed at the air. The cane knife met the whip mid-flight, the sharp edge of the blade slicing through the leather with ease. The whip fell to the ground, severed in half. Vicente's eyes went wide with shock and rage. "You!" he shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "You dare!" But before he could finish, Pedro was already moving, his feet carrying him toward the overseer with a speed that surprised even him. Vicente staggered backward, raising his fists, but it was too late. Pedro, with all the years of humiliation and suffering stored in his body, lunged forward. The cane knife met its target, a deep gash across Vicente's chest. The overseer's mouth opened in a silent scream as he fell to the ground, his blood staining the soil beneath him. Pedro stood over him, the knife still gripped tightly in his hand, his breath heavy. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had acted, and the act of violence had been swift, inevitable. The moment had arrived, the moment he had been waiting for. The slave had risen against his master, and there was no turning back now. The other slaves in the field stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear and awe. They had seen the violence before, but never like this. Never had a slave dared to strike back so openly, so fiercely. They had witnessed many deaths, many beatings, but this was different. This was a rebellion, an act of defiance against the very system that had enslaved them. Pedro's gaze swept across the field, meeting the eyes of the other slaves. His breath slowed, his grip tightening around the knife. The power he had taken with one slash of the blade was now his to wield, but he knew it would come at a cost. The overseers would not let this go unpunished. The plantation owners would retaliate, and Pedro's life would be forfeit. But for the first time in his life, Pedro didn't care. He had taken a life, but he had also given himself the only thing he had ever longed for, the chance to choose his fate. The moment of violence had shattered the silence of the field, and now there was a tense stillness in the air. The slaves knew that this could mean their deaths, but they also knew that this act of rebellion had changed everything. They were no longer just tools in the fields, no longer just shadows in the background of the plantation's wealth. They were free men and women, if only for a moment, if only in the truth of what they had witnessed. Pedro turned away from the fallen overseer and began to walk toward the edge of the field. His steps were deliberate, and his mind was set. He knew the risks, knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger. But there was no going back now. His act of rebellion had begun, and with it, he would lead them all. The plantation had changed forever. The air in the sugarcane fields was thick with tension after Pedro's act of defiance. The slaves, who had witnessed the brutal strike against the overseer, remained silent in the aftermath, their eyes wide with fear and awe. Pedro could feel the weight of their gazes, the flicker of hope that had sparked in them, but also the deep fear of what would come next. The plantation had always been a place where any sign of rebellion was punished severely. But now, there was no turning back. The course had been set, and Pedro's actions had opened the door to something far greater than a single act of defiance. Pedro moved quickly, his steps carrying him away from the scene of the attack. He knew that within moments, the guards would be alerted, the overseers would rally, and the pursuit would begin. The plantation would not tolerate an uprising, and the price of rebellion would be high. But Pedro was prepared to pay that price. The distant sound of footsteps on the gravel path reached his ears as he made his way toward the edge of the plantation. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was calm, clear. He had acted out of necessity, driven by years of suffering and injustice. He had taken the first step in a larger war. A war that would not be fought with whips or chains, but with courage and defiance. His time had come to lead. Pedro reached the edge of the fields and disappeared into the woods that bordered the plantation. The thick underbrush and towering trees provided some cover, but he knew he didn't have much time before the pursuit began. He had to act quickly, gather others, and move before the guards realized what had happened. As Pedro made his way through the dark forest, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. His mind replayed the moments when he had struck the overseer, the crack of the whip, the smell of blood in the air. He had killed a man, but he had also taken a step toward freedom, not just for himself, but for everyone who lived under the weight of the plantation's cruelty. The forest was quiet, the sounds of the night creatures all around him, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the task at hand. He had learned long ago to keep his wits about him, to trust no one but himself. But there was something different now, a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was fighting back. Pedro had no illusions about the danger he was in. His escape from the plantation would not be easy, and he knew that the plantation owners would send their best trackers after him. They would not let a slave rebel so easily. But Pedro had spent years learning the land, understanding the rhythms of the plantation, and he knew that there were places where the guards would not follow. The forest was one of those places. The slaves had long used it as a refuge, a place where they could hide and regroup, away from the eyes of the overseers. Pedro would find those who were willing to stand with him, those who were ready to fight. As he moved deeper into the forest, Pedro's thoughts turned to the other slaves on the plantation. He knew that there were many who were too frightened to act, too beaten down by the years of abuse to rise up. But there were others. Like him, men and women who had endured long enough, who had suffered enough to know that their lives had no worth unless they fought for it. They were the ones he needed to find. He reached a small clearing in the forest and paused, listening carefully. The sound of footsteps reached his ears, and Pedro tensed, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his cane knife. But it was not a guard. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her face shadowed but familiar. It was Zainab. She had been another of the slaves on the plantation, one of the strongest and most intelligent women Pedro had ever known. He had watched her for years, admired her quiet strength, and the way she seemed to hold a power that came from within. She had been silent during the years of toil, but Pedro knew that she, too, had been waiting for the right moment to act. "You're alive," Pedro said, his voice hoarse with the strain of the past hours. Zainab's eyes flickered in the dim light, and she nodded. "I heard what happened. The overseer is dead. I didn't expect you to strike so soon, but I knew you would." Pedro's eyes narrowed. "You knew?" Zainab stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "I've been watching, Pedro. I've seen the way you've carried yourself. I've seen the fire in your eyes. We all have. You're not the only one who's had enough. There are others who are ready to rise." Pedro's heart quickened. He hadn't expected Zainab to be so certain, to be so sure of what he had done. He had hoped, of course, that others would follow, but it seemed impossible that any would dare to act, not with the heavy hand of the masters on their backs. "They'll be looking for us," Pedro said, his voice tense. "The guards will be coming, and they won't stop until they find me. But I don't think they'll find us if we move quickly." Zainab nodded again, her eyes unwavering. "We've been waiting for this moment. You're not alone in this fight, Pedro. I've been working with others quietly. We've been preparing. It's time to act." Pedro's pulse quickened. "You've been working with others?" Zainab's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You're not the only one who's been keeping an eye on things. There are others, Pedro. People who have seen the injustice and who are ready to take a stand." Pedro could feel the weight of her words. The idea of a rebellion, of a collective movement, had always seemed like a distant dream, but now it felt real. His pulse raced as the thought of rising up, of striking back against the plantation owners, took shape in his mind. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice steady. "To the north," Zainab said, her voice like a low whisper. "We've got to move before the sun rises. There are safe houses, allies who will help us, but we have to be quick." Pedro didn't hesitate. The decision had been made. He had already taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. As he turned to follow Zainab into the shadows of the forest, the faintest glimmer of hope flared inside him. The fight for freedom had begun. The night was thick with the scent of damp earth and the promise of rebellion. As Pedro moved through the dense forest, with Zainab leading the way, his heart pounded with the weight of what had just transpired. The plantation was still far behind them, but the echo of the prince's death reverberated in his mind. The prince's blood, which stained his hands, had now spilled over into something far larger and uprising. There was no turning back, no undoing the moment he had taken the overseer's life. Zainab moved through the forest with quiet assurance, her eyes scanning the path ahead. She had lived in these woods before, knew them better than most. They were a labyrinth of trees, winding rivers, and thick underbrush, perfect for hiding those who had nowhere else to turn. Pedro admired her calm demeanor. She was a woman who had lived through much, yet never seemed to lose control. But he could see the flicker of determination in her eyes as she glanced back at him. "The others are waiting," Zainab said softly, her voice low and cautious. "We'll need to be quick. The news of what happened at the fields will spread fast. I've already sent word to those who are ready to rise." Pedro nodded, feeling the heaviness in his chest. This wasn't just about the prince anymore, or even about the overseer. This was a movement, a collective fury of all those who had suffered under the yoke of the plantation system, a fury that could no longer be contained. They traveled for what felt like hours, the trees around them dark and silent, their leaves rustling faintly as if they were whispering the secrets of the world. Every step Pedro took carried him further away from the plantation, further away from everything he had known. The weight of the cane knife at his side was a reminder that he was no longer just a slave. He was a rebel, a leader of a cause that could change everything. When they reached the clearing where the others had gathered, Zainab gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling to Pedro that it was time to stop. He could see the flickering glow of a small campfire through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The group of slaves, no more than a dozen in number, stood huddled together in quiet conversation. They looked up as Pedro and Zainab entered the clearing, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and something else, hope. Pedro's eyes scanned the group. There was Samuel, a tall man with broad shoulders who had worked alongside him in the fields. He had always been a quiet man, his eyes thoughtful, his movements measured. Then there was Maria, a woman in her 30s with a fire in her gaze. She had been a cook in the master's house, a position that had given her some measure of freedom, but it had also exposed her to the worst of the master's cruelty. There were others, women, men, all of them scarred in their own ways by the brutal system of slavery, but none of them broken. Pedro stepped forward, his heart thundering in his chest. This was the moment. This was the beginning of something he could never have imagined just days ago. The slave revolt had begun, and he was its spark. "We've all seen the same things," Pedro began, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We've all felt the same pain, the same injustice, and we've all been waiting for the right moment. That moment is now." The others gathered around him, their eyes wide, their expressions full of uncertainty and fear, but also something else, something Pedro had longed to see in their faces: resolve. "The master is dead," Pedro continued, his voice gaining strength. "And the plantation system is as weak as it has ever been, but it's not enough for one man to die. It's not enough for just one overseer to fall. This plantation, this system must burn to the ground." A murmur of agreement ran through the group, and Pedro could see that the fire he had ignited in himself had sparked something in them as well. They were no longer just slaves, they were soldiers in a fight for their freedom. "But we can't do this alone," Zainab interjected, stepping forward. "We need to be smart. We need to move quietly, stay hidden, and find allies in the city. The guards will be looking for us by morning. If we're going to succeed, we need to strike fast, strike together." Pedro nodded. "We won't fight on our own terms. We'll strike when they least expect it. We have the element of surprise." The group gathered around the campfire, and Pedro shared the details of the plan he had been formulating. It was simple but deadly. A coordinated attack on the plantation guards, with every slave on the estate rising at once. The workers in the fields, the servants in the house, and the women and men hidden in the shadows of the city would unite to bring the plantation to its knees. But Pedro knew that this attack would be the beginning of something bigger. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting to reshape their world. As the night wore on, they made their plans in whispers, their voices barely audible over the crackling fire. Pedro's mind raced with possibilities, with contingencies, with every potential risk. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This was their only chance. The world they had known, the world of slavery and servitude, had to end tonight. They would take the first steps to freedom, no matter the cost. The fire flickered and danced, casting fleeting shadows across the faces of those who stood with him. Pedro could see it in their eyes, the same fire that burned in his own chest. They were ready. But Pedro also knew that this rebellion would not be without consequences. They were taking on the might of the plantation system. And there would be blood. There would be violence. But that was the price of freedom. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, the plan was set. Pedro and his fellow rebels would strike at dawn, when the guards were least expecting it. They would take the weapons they had stolen from the overseers and use them to fight back. They would storm the plantation and free everyone who still remained in chains. As Pedro lay down to rest for the night, he felt a strange sense of calm. The battle had been chosen. The path had been set. The war had begun. The night passed slowly, as if time itself had been stretched and distorted by the weight of what was to come. Pedro lay awake in the darkness, his mind whirring with thoughts of the dawn. It was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment they had sacrificed everything for. But in that moment of quiet anticipation, Pedro could not ignore the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his resolve. They were slaves no more. They were rebels, and rebellion was a dangerous thing. The fire had burned low, the warmth from the embers long gone, and the air was thick with the scent of the earth. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as though the land itself knew what was about to unfold. Pedro knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. It was time. At the break of dawn, Zainab was the first to stir. Her silhouette was faint against the dim light of morning, but her eyes were sharp, her movements swift and purposeful. She had been one of the first to understand the weight of this moment, to grasp what Pedro was asking of them all. She had been a servant in the house for years, and now she would be part of the force that tore it down. Pedro stood silently beside her, his gaze sweeping over the others who had gathered in the clearing. Samuel, Maria, and the rest of the slaves, each of them was ready. Their faces were hard with resolve, yet there was something else in their eyes, a flicker of fear. The fear of what they would become, the fear of the cost of their actions. "We strike now," Pedro said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of leadership. He looked each of them in the eyes, willing them to see beyond their fear and into the future they could create. "We do this for ourselves, for every slave still chained to this land. We take what we deserve." Zainab nodded sharply. She had never been one for words. She was a woman of action, and she had been waiting for this day as long as Pedro had. The group moved swiftly through the forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. Pedro led them through familiar paths, the ones they had carefully scouted over the past few days. He had memorized every twist and turn of the land surrounding the plantation, the river that ran nearby, the hidden trail that led to the far end of the estate, the distant hills where the guards seldom patrolled. Everything had been planned with precision. There would be no hesitation, no mistakes. They were going to win. The plantation, once a place of oppression and death, now loomed ahead of them like a fortress. The grand house, where the master had once lived in luxury, stood at the center of it all. It was a symbol of everything Pedro had despised, everything he had fought against, but it was also a symbol of the war that had begun. No longer would it be the seat of power, it would be their battleground. The slaves were already in position, scattered throughout the estate. The workers in the fields, the servants in the house, and the women and men who had been hidden in the shadows now rose up, ready to fight. The overseers had no idea what was coming. Pedro and Zainab exchanged one last glance before they moved toward the house. It was time to light the fire, to show the world that they had the power to bring it all down. Pedro's heart raced as he neared the main gate. He could see the guards now, distant figures standing watch, unaware of the rebellion unfolding around them. The first part of the plan was simple: to take out the guards, silence the ones who would alert the rest of the plantation. With the guards neutralized, they would take control of the estate, liberating the slaves and putting an end to the horrors they had endured. The first guard fell swiftly, a knife to the throat before he had a chance to raise his alarm. It was quick, silent. The second guard was just as easy to dispatch, his body collapsing in the dirt without a sound. Pedro moved like a shadow, his heart thundering in his chest as he worked with brutal efficiency, taking out each guard in his path. Zainab was close behind, her movements equally precise, her eyes cold with purpose. The element of surprise was theirs. The estate's walls were now breached, the rebellion in full swing. Pedro's mind was focused, his senses alive to the sounds of the battle unfolding around him. The screams of the guards, the shouts of the slaves as they fought back, filled the air. There was chaos, but there was also a strange sense of relief. The air felt different now, as if the weight of oppression had been lifted, if only for a moment. They reached the main house, the grand doors standing tall in front of them. Pedro knew that the battle was not yet won. The master's family, those who had enslaved them for so long, were inside, and they would not go down without a fight. Inside the house, the master's family was stirring. Pedro could hear their voices, muffled by the thick walls of the estate. He motioned for Zainab to stay back, his mind already working out the next step. The master, Senhor Rocha, was the one who needed to be dealt with. It was his death that would mark the end of this rebellion, the end of the system that had kept them all in chains. As Pedro approached the door, his hand tightening around the cane knife, a sense of finality washed over him. This was it. There was no more running, no more hiding. The fate of the plantation, of the slaves, of Brazil itself, was in his hands. He pushed the door open slowly, his heart beating loudly in his chest. The master was there, sitting in his study, his back turned to Pedro. He had not yet realized what was happening outside the walls of his house. The moment Pedro had been waiting for had come, but the moment was also one of quiet reckoning. This man, Senhor Rocha, had made Pedro and the others live as animals. He had stolen their dignity, their lives, their families. And now, Pedro's hand gripped the cane knife tightly, his breath steady. There was no hesitation now, no second thoughts. The rebellion was in full swing, and Pedro would be its instrument of justice. The time for mercy had passed. With one swift motion, the blade sank into the master's back. The house fell silent after the death of Senhor Rocha. Pedro stood over the body, the cane knife still buried in the master's back, his breath coming in shallow, steady bursts. The blood pooled slowly on the marble floor, staining the elegant carpets and walls that had once seemed so untouchable. The reality of the moment set in. Pedro had killed the man who had enslaved him, the man who had subjected so many to endless pain and suffering. It should have been a triumph, a final victory. But the blood in his hands, the blood on the floor, felt cold. The weight of the death was heavier than he had imagined. It was a blow not just to Rocha but to the entire system that had supported him, the system that had kept the enslaved people chained in mind and body. Zainab stepped into the room behind him, her footsteps light but purposeful. She stood quietly, observing the body of the man who had caused so much pain. Pedro could see the same resolve in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her to take part in this rebellion. "It's done," Pedro said, his voice thick with the reality of what they had just done. Zainab's eyes narrowed. "No, it's only begun. We've only just begun, Pedro." Her words were clear and unwavering, like a blade cutting through the air. "The master is dead, but that doesn't change the world overnight. There will be more blood, more fighting." Pedro looked down at the corpse, his chest tightening. He knew she was right. The death of one man was not enough to bring down a system. It would take more than that. "We can't stop now," Zainab continued, her eyes hardening. "Others will rise to take his place. But we have something they don't. The people. The slaves who are ready to fight, who have been waiting for this moment. We can make them see that they're no longer powerless." Pedro's grip on the cane knife loosened. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the next steps. The rebellion was far from over. This was only the first strike, the opening chapter in a larger war that would unfold across the land. It would take more than death to overthrow the plantation system. It would take fire. It would take unity. It would take everything they had left. "There's no going back," Pedro muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've crossed the point of no return." Zainab nodded, her face grim but determined. "And we'll make them pay. All of them." The sounds of the rebellion outside continued to rage, the cries of the slaves, the gunshots echoing through the estate, the chaos of battle reaching its peak. Pedro knew that this was just the beginning. The slaves had risen, and the plantation was no longer a place of quiet oppression, it was a battleground. Pedro moved toward the door, Zainab by his side. The air outside was thick with smoke and the smell of burning. The sounds of the revolt were getting louder. It was a fever pitch now, a wave of violence and fury that could not be stopped. The slaves were fighting back, not just against their masters, but against everything that had kept them in chains. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now a site of rebellion, a place where the oppressed had begun to fight for their freedom. The walls of the estate were coming down, both literally and figuratively. There was no more silence, no more submission. The slaves were no longer invisible, they were a force to be reckoned with. As Pedro stepped into the chaos outside, he felt the full weight of the revolution on his shoulders. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment that would change the fate of everyone on this land. The rich might have their wealth, but the slaves had something far more powerful: the will to fight. They had seen the violence. They had witnessed the injustice, and now they were demanding their freedom. The path ahead was unclear, but Pedro knew that the only way forward was through the fire. The plantation would burn, and with it, the chains that had bound them all. As they made their way toward the gathering of rebels, Pedro's heart began to beat with something else: hope. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was in control, like he had a chance to make a real difference. This war, this fight for freedom, had only just begun. But Pedro was ready, and so were they.